In the harsh Dakota Territory of 1886, the town of Widow's Ridge knew how to break spirits. When pregnant widow Sadie Quinn arrived with nothing but the clothes on her back, the townsfolk thought they'd found their latest source of cruel entertainment. They gave her a shack on the edge of town, occupied by Colt Ramsey, a once legendary cowboy now confined to a crude wooden wheelchair, paralyzed from a mining accident and bitter as winter wind. What started as the town's sick joke became something they never expected. Day after day, Sadie tended to Colt with quiet determination, cleaning his wounds, cooking his meals, reading by firelight, while he stared at nothing from his wooden chair. The townspeople watched and whispered, waiting for her to give up like everyone else had. But something remarkable began to happen in that broken-down shack, a twitch of fingers, a whispered word, a flicker of the fire that once made Colt Ramsey the most feared rider in the territory. How does a man trapped in a wooden wheelchair become the hero who saves an entire town?
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The morning Sadie Quinn first set foot in Widow's Ridge, the October wind carried the scent of dying leaves and distant snow. She stepped down from the supply wagon with all the grace her swollen belly would allow, one hand pressed to her lower back, the other clutching a worn leather satchel that contained everything she owned in this world. The wedding ring on her finger caught what little sunlight filtered through the gray clouds, a simple gold band that had belonged to her grandmother, then her mother, and finally graced her own hand during those precious 18 months of marriage. To Thomas, the wagon driver, a weathered man named Jasper, who'd spoken barely 10 words during their 3-day journey from Deadwood, spat tobacco juice into the dust and nodded toward the ramshackle collection of buildings that passed for a town. "This here's Widow's Ridge, ma'am. Ain't much to look at, but it's what you paid for." Sadie surveyed her new home with the practiced eye of a woman who'd learned not to expect much from life. The main street, if it could be called that, was little more than a wide dirt path flanked by a dozen buildings in various states of decay. A general store with a sagging porch dominated the center of town, its painted sign so faded she could barely make out the words Morrison's Mercantile. Next to it squatted a saloon called the Broken Wheel, its batwing doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. Across the street, a small building bore the weathered shingle of Doc Hollis, physician, while further down she could see what might have been a blacksmith shop, identifiable only by the cold forge and scattered horseshoes in the yard. It was the people who truly told the story of Widow's Ridge. Men lounged outside the saloon, even at this early hour, their clothes stained with drink and disappointment. Women hurried past with their heads down, avoiding eye contact with strangers. Children played in the mud with hollow eyes that belonged on much older faces. This was a place where hope came to die, she realized, and perhaps that made it perfect for someone like her. "Where might I find lodging?" she asked Jasper, though part of her already dreaded the answer. The driver scratched his grizzled chin and looked uncomfortable. "Well, ma'am, that's a bit of a problem. Ain't no proper hotel here, and the boarding house burned down last spring. Widow Henley might take you in, but—" He trailed off, his eyes dropping to her obviously pregnant state. "But she won't want." An unmarried woman with child, Sadie finished for him. She'd heard similar words in 3 other towns during her journey west. The assumption that she was unwed followed her like a shadow, despite the ring on her finger. Apparently, pregnancy without a visible husband was scandal enough to close doors and harden hearts. From the saloon, she heard rough laughter, the kind that held no warmth. Several men had noticed her arrival and were pointing in her direction, their comments too distant to hear, but their intentions clear enough. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and lifted her chin. She'd faced worse than small-town gossips. "I'll speak with this Widow Henley," she said firmly. "Where might I find her?" Jasper pointed toward a 2-story house at the far end of the street, painted a faded yellow that had once been cheerful. "That's her place, but ma'am, I don't think—" "Thank you for your concern," Sadie interrupted gently. "I'll manage from here." As the wagon rolled away in a cloud of dust, leaving her standing alone with her single satchel, Sadie felt the weight of a dozen pairs of eyes upon her. The men from the saloon had wandered closer, emboldened by drink and the entertainment value of a lone woman. Their leader, a bear of a man with a black beard stained yellow around his mouth, stepped forward with a grin that showed several missing teeth. "Well, well," he drawled, his voice carrying the lazy cruelty of a cat playing with a mouse. "What have we here?" "A lady in distress, boys. Ain't that just about the most touching thing you ever did see?" His companions chuckled, and Sadie noticed how they spread out slightly, cutting off her easy retreat. She'd seen this dance before, predators circling wounded prey. But Thomas had taught her that the trick to dealing with bullies was to never let them see fear, so she met the big man's eyes directly. "I'm looking for Widow Henley," she said calmly. "I was told she might have a room available." The man's grin widened. "Oh, she might indeed. But Widow Henley, she's particular about her guests. Don't much care for ... complications." His eyes dropped meaningfully to her belly. "Name's Bull Garrison, and these here, my boys. We sort of keep the peace in Widow's Ridge, you might say." "How noble of you," Sadie replied, and was rewarded by a flash of uncertainty in Bull's eyes. Clearly, he'd expected tears or pleading, not polite sarcasm. Before he could recover his composure, a new voice cut through the tension. "Bull Garrison, you leave that woman be." The voice belonged to a thin, elderly man who emerged from the building marked as the doctor's office. He moved with the careful precision of someone whose joints protested every step, but his back was straight and his eyes were sharp behind wire-rimmed spectacles. A neatly trimmed white beard framed a face that had seen too much suffering to be impressed by small-town bullies. "Doc Hollis," Bull said, his tone immediately more respectful. "Just being neighborly, that's all. Your kind of neighborly has a way of leaving folks worse off than when you started," the doctor replied dryly. He turned to Sadie with a slight bow. "Ma'am, I'm Dr. Marcus Hollis. Welcome to our little community." "Sadie Quinn," she replied gratefully. "I was hoping to find lodging." Dr. Hollis glanced at Bull and his men, who were still hovering nearby like vultures. "Boys, don't you have somewhere else to be? Last I heard, the sheriff was looking for you, Bull. Something about those missing cattle from the Henderson place." Bull's face darkened, but he gestured to his men. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the good doctor to his charity work." As they walked away, he called back over his shoulder, "Enjoy your stay. Mrs. Quinn, Widow's Ridge has a way of testing folks. Some pass ... others don't." When they were out of earshot, Dr. Hollis shook his head. "I apologize for that welcome. Mrs. Quinn, Bull and his cronies think they run this town, and unfortunately, they're not entirely wrong." "I've dealt with worse," Sadie said, though she appreciated the doctor's intervention. "You mentioned the sheriff was looking for him?" "Sheriff Brennan does his best, but he's one man in a town full of problems. The truth is, Mrs. Quinn, Widow's Ridge isn't the safest place for a woman in your condition. Might I ask what brings you to our humble community?" Sadie touched her wedding ring absently, a gesture that didn't go unnoticed by the observant physician. "My husband died in a mining accident near Deadwood 3 months ago. I need a fresh start." Dr. Hollis nodded with the understanding of a man who'd seen his share of tragedy. "I'm sorry for your loss. As for lodging, I'm afraid your options are limited. Widow Henley might take you in, but she's not known for her charitable disposition. There's a boarding house of sorts above the saloon, but that would hardly be appropriate for a lady. What would you suggest, doctor?" The older man was quiet for a long moment, clearly wrestling with something. Finally, he sighed. "There is one possibility, though I hesitate to mention it. There's a cabin on the outskirts of town, nothing fancy. Mind you, it's occupied after a fashion." "After a fashion?" "The current resident is a man named Colt Ramsey. He was injured in a mining accident about 2 years ago, left paralyzed from the waist down. The town provides him with basic necessities, but he's not exactly what you'd call sociable company." Sadie frowned. "You're suggesting I share quarters with a strange man?" "Good Lord, no," Dr. Hollis said quickly. "The cabin has 2 rooms, and Colt barely leaves his chair these days. He's given up on most things, including conversation." But the cabin is sound. There's a good well, and it would give you shelter while you decide on more permanent arrangements." Before Sadie could respond, a new voice joined the conversation. "Doc's being kind, honey, but he ain't telling the whole truth." The speaker was a woman perhaps 10 years older than Sadie, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of hard work. She wore a simple brown dress and a no-nonsense expression that suggested she'd heard every excuse and seen every kind of foolishness the world had to offer. "Martha Kellerman," the woman introduced herself. "I run the saloon, such as it is. And before you get any ideas about my moral character, let me tell you that I've buried 2 husbands and raised 3 children, so I've earned the right to speak plain." "What isn't the doctor telling me?" Sadie asked. Martha glanced at Dr. Hollis, who looked uncomfortable. Colt Ramsey wasn't just any cowboy before his accident. He was the best rider, the fastest gun, and the most feared man in 3 territories. When he got hurt, it broke something in him that goes deeper than his spine. He's been sitting in that cabin for 2 years, drinking himself to death and snarling at anyone who tries to help. "Martha," Dr. Hollis protested. "Let me finish," Martha said firmly. "The truth is, Mrs. Quinn, that cabin's become like a tomb, and Colt's the ghost haunting it. Most folk in town have given up on him entirely. But—" She paused, studying Sadie with sharp eyes. "You've got the look of someone who doesn't give up easy. Maybe that's what both of you need." Sadie considered this information carefully. The situation was far from ideal, but her alternatives seemed even worse. "This Mr. Ramsey, is he dangerous?" "Not anymore," Martha said sadly. "Dangerous requires caring about something, and Colt. Ramsey doesn't care about anything these days, least of all himself." Dr. Hollis cleared his throat. "If you're seriously considering this arrangement, I should mention that I check on Colt twice a week. I could ensure that the situation remains appropriate. And I'd make sure you had everything you needed," Martha added. "Lord knows that cabin could use a woman's touch, and Colt could use the company, whether he wants it or not." Sadie looked down the street toward Widow Henley's yellow house, then back at the saloon with its dubious boarding arrangements. The baby moved within her, a gentle reminder that her choices affected more than just herself. Sometimes, she reflected, life offered no perfect options, only the courage to make the best of imperfect ones. "Could I see this cabin before I decide?" Dr. Hollis nodded. "Of course. Fair warning, though it's not much to look at, and Colt ... Well, he won't exactly roll out the welcome mat." As they walked through town toward the outskirts, Sadie noticed how people watched their little procession with curious eyes. By evening, she knew, the entire population of Widow's Ridge would know about the pregnant widow who'd come to stay with the broken cowboy. Let them talk, she thought. She'd weathered gossip before. The cabin sat in a small clearing, perhaps a quarter-mile from the main street, surrounded by scrub pine and sagebrush. It was smaller than she'd hoped, but larger than she'd feared, a simple log structure with a stone chimney and a covered porch that sagged slightly on one side. The windows were grimy, and the yard was scattered with the debris of a man who'd stopped caring about appearances. But the roof looked sound, and the walls appeared solid. "Colt?" Dr. Hollis called as they approached the front door. "I've brought someone to meet you." The response from inside was a muffled growl that might have been words, followed by what sounded like a bottle being thrown against a wall. "He's having one of his better days," Martha said dryly. Dr. Hollis knocked on the door. "Colt, open up. We need to talk." After a long moment, they heard the sound of wooden wheels on floorboards, and the door swung open to reveal a man who might once have been magnificent. Even seated in his crude wooden wheelchair, Colt Ramsey was impressive. Broad shoulders, strong arms, and a face that would have been handsome if not for the bitter lines carved by pain and disappointment. His dark hair hung past his collar. Unkempt and a several days' growth of beard couldn't hide the sharp angles of his jaw. But it was his eyes that told the real story, dark brown eyes that held all the warmth of a winter grave. "What do you want, Doc?" he asked, his voice a low rasp that suggested too much whiskey and too little use. "Colt, I'd like you to meet Mrs. Sadie Quinn. She's new to town and needs a place to stay. I thought perhaps. No. The word was flat. Final, delivered without even looking at Sadie. Now hold on, Martha began, but Colt's glare silenced her. I said no. I don't want company. I don't need help. And I sure as hell don't want some woman cluttering up my space. For the first time since arriving in Widow's Ridge, Sadie felt her temper stir. She'd been patronized, threatened, and dismissed, but there was something about this man's flat rejection that struck her wrong. Maybe it was the pregnancy hormones, or maybe it was just the accumulated frustration of weeks of closed doors and turned backs, but she found herself stepping forward. Mr. Ramsey, she said calmly, I'm not asking for charity. I can pay rent, keep house, and cook decent meals. I need shelter, and you could apparently use someone to clean this place before the health inspector condemns it. Colt's eyes focused on her for the first time, taking in her condition and her determined expression. Lady, you don't want to stay here? This ain't a place for ... He gestured vaguely at her belly. For that, what I want, Sadie said firmly, is a roof over my head and 4 walls around me. Everything else, I can handle myself. They stared at each other for a long moment, and Sadie saw something flicker in those dead eyes, surprise, perhaps, or grudging respect. Finally, Colt rolled his chair back from the doorway. $2 a week, he said. You keep to your side. I'll keep to mine. And don't expect conversation. As Sadie stepped across the threshold into her new home, she caught Martha's approving nod and Dr. Hollis's concerned frown. The cabin smelled of whiskey, unwashed clothes, and despair, but it was shelter. And that was enough for now. Sometimes, she thought as she set her satchel down in what would be her room, the most important journeys began with the smallest steps. Storm arrived 3 days after Sadie moved into the cabin, sweeping down from the northern mountains with the fury of an angry god. She'd been living quietly alongside Colt, maintaining their unspoken agreement of mutual avoidance. He spent his days in the main room, alternating between staring out the window and working his way through a seemingly endless supply of whiskey bottles. She kept to her small bedroom in the kitchen area, venturing into his domain only to prepare meals that he accepted with grunts that might have been thanks. But when the wind began howling like a wounded animal, the first fat snowflakes started falling. Sadie knew their careful separation was about to be tested by evening. The snow was coming down so thick she could barely see the woodpile from the kitchen window. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the wind was rattling the cabin's walls with increasing violence. She'd lived through prairie storms before, but this felt different, bigger, hungrier, like something that could swallow the world. This is going to be a bad one, she said, more to herself than to Colt, as she checked their supply of firewood stacked beside the hearth. From his position near the window, Colt made a non-committal sound. He'd been watching the storm's approach with the intensity of a man reading his own death sentence, and Sadie wondered if he knew something about frontier weather that she didn't. How long do these storms usually last? She asked, genuinely curious. Colt was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke without turning from the window. Could be 3 days, could be a week. Depends on how much the mountains want to punish us. It was the longest sentence he'd spoken to her since she'd arrived, and Sadie found herself oddly pleased by this small breach in his wall of silence. Do we have enough supplies? Food? Yes. Firewood. He shrugged. We'll find out. By midnight, the storm had reached its full fury. Snow piled against the windows in drifts that blocked out the moonlight, and the wind screamed around the cabin like a living thing trying to tear it apart. Sadie lay in her narrow bed, listening to the timbers creak and groan under the assault. When the first pain hit it started as a low, dull ache in her lower back, the kind she'd been experiencing on and off for weeks. Dr. Hollis had warned her that the baby might come early. First children often did, especially when their mothers had endured stress and hardship. But this pain was different, sharper, with an urgency that made her sit up in sudden alarm. She breathed carefully, counting the seconds until the pain subsided, then waited. 10 minutes later, it came again, stronger this time, radiating from her back around to her abdomen in a band of fire that left her gasping. "No," she whispered to the darkness. "Not now. Not in this storm." But babies, she knew, had their own schedules. And this one had apparently decided that a blizzard was the perfect time to make its entrance into the world. The third contraction brought her to her feet, one hand pressed against the wall for support, the other cradling her belly. She needed help, needed Dr. Hollis, needed anyone with more experience than her own terrified instincts. But the storm outside was a white wall of death, and she knew no one could reach them until it passed. She was debating whether to wake Colt, when the fourth contraction hit, and this one was strong enough to tear a cry from her lips before she could stop it. "Mrs. Quinn?" Colt's voice came through the thin wall that separated their rooms. "You all right in there?" "I'm fine," she managed, though even she could hear the lie in her voice. There was a pause, then the sound of his wheelchair rolling across the floor. "Ma'am, I may not know much about women, but I know what pain sounds like. What's wrong?" Another contraction gripped her, and this time she couldn't hold back the gasp. "The baby," she said through gritted teeth. I think it's coming." The silence that followed was so complete she might have thought he'd left, if not for the fact that she could hear his breathing through the wall. "Mrs. Quinn," he said finally, his voice carefully controlled, "I need you to listen to me. Are you sure? Sometimes false labor can—" "I'm sure," she interrupted, because another wave of pain was building, and she could feel something fundamental shifting inside her body. "Oh God, I'm sure." She heard him curse, a string of words that would have made a saloon keeper blush, followed by the sound of his chair moving rapidly around the main room. "All right," he called. "I'm going to come in there, unless you got some objection to impropriety, because right now it seems like the least of our problems." "Come in," she gasped, beyond caring about social conventions. The door opened, and Colt rolled his chair into her small room, taking in the scene with the quick assessment of a man accustomed to crisis. Sadie was leaning against the foot of the bed, still in her nightgown, her face pale with pain and fear. "How far apart are the pains?" he asked, his voice steady now, professional. 5 minutes, maybe less. He nodded grimly. "That's moving fast for a first baby. We need to get you more comfortable." He looked around the small room, calculating. "Can you make it to the main room? Closer to the fire, more space to work." Work? The word suggested he knew what he was doing, and Sadie felt a flicker of hope. "You've done this before?" "Not exactly," Colt admitted, "but I've birthed enough calves and foals to know the basics. The principle's the same, more or less." Under other circumstances, Sadie might have been offended by the comparison, but another contraction was building, and she found herself grateful for any experience, even if it involved livestock together. They made the awkward journey to the main room, Colt rolling alongside her as she shuffled forward, pausing when the contractions hit. He'd pushed his chair close to the fire and was gathering supplies, clean linens from the chest by the window, a sharp knife from the kitchen, a bottle of whiskey that she suspected wasn't entirely for medicinal purposes. "Mrs. Quinn," he said, as she settled onto the makeshift bed he'd created near the hearth, "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. Have you ever— that is, do you know anything about birthing?" "Nothing," she admitted. "My mother died when I was young, and I was never around other women when this happened." Colt nodded, and she saw him square his shoulders as if preparing for battle. "All right then, we'll figure it out together." For the next several hours, as the storm raged outside and the fire crackled in the hearth, Sadie discovered that Colt Ramsey was capable of extraordinary gentleness. Despite his paralyzed legs and the confines of his wooden wheelchair, he managed to be exactly where she needed him, offering water when her mouth went dry, supporting her when the contractions made it impossible to lie still, speaking in a low, steady voice that somehow cut through the chaos of pain and fear. "That's it," he murmured as she gripped his hand during a particularly fierce contraction. "Breathe through it. Don't fight it. Just let it do what it needs to do." "I can't," she gasped. "It's too much. You can," he said firmly. "You're stronger than you know." I've seen it in you since the day you arrived, the way you stood up to Bull Garrison, the way you walked into this cabin like you owned it. You don't give up, Sadie Quinn. That baby of yours is counting on that." It was the first time he'd used her given name, and somehow that small intimacy gave her strength. She focused on his voice, on the steady grip of his calloused hands, on the warmth of the fire that painted dancing shadows on the cabin walls. When the baby finally came, arriving in a rush of blood and fluid that left Sadie crying with relief and exhaustion, it was Colt who caught the tiny, slippery form in his steady hands. For a moment that seemed to stretch forever, the infant lay still and silent, and Sadie felt her heart stop. "Why isn't it crying?" she whispered. Colt was already moving, turning the baby gently, clearing its mouth and nose with practiced efficiency. Then he did something that would haunt Sadie's memory for years to come. This broken man, who claimed he didn't care about anything, leaned forward in his wheelchair and breathed life into her child, his lips against the tiny face, coaxing breath into small lungs. The baby's first cry was weak, but unmistakably alive, and the sound of it seemed to fill the cabin with something that had been missing. Hope. "Is it?" Sadie asked, tears streaming down her face. "She?" Colt said softly, wrapping the baby in a clean cloth before placing her gently on Sadie's chest. "You have a daughter." Sadie looked down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and absolutely perfect, and felt something shift in the very foundations of her world. This small person, who had chosen a blizzard as her dramatic entrance, who had survived being born in a frontier cabin with only a paralyzed cowboy as midwife, this was her daughter. "Hello, little one," she whispered, and the baby's eyes opened, unfocused but searching. Colt sat back in his wheelchair, suddenly aware of what they'd just accomplished. His hands were shaking now that the crisis had passed, and he reached for the whiskey bottle with movements that weren't quite steady. "You did good," he said quietly. "Both of you." Sadie looked up at him, this man who'd claimed he didn't care about anything, who'd just spent hours helping bring her child safely into the world. His face was exhausted, streaked with sweat, despite the cold, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there before, a spark of the man he used to be. "Thank you," she said simply, but the words carried the weight of everything she couldn't express. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the cabin, warmed by fire and the miracle of new life, something had changed forever. The paralyzed cowboy and the pregnant widow were no longer strangers sharing space out of necessity. They were partners who had faced the impossible together and emerged victorious. As dawn broke gray and muted through the snow-covered windows, Colt pulled his chair closer to the fire and settled in to keep watch over the mother and child. For the first time in 2 years, he had something worth protecting, and the realization both terrified and thrilled him. The storm would pass, he knew. They always did. But what had been born in this cabin during the long, dark hours? Trust, hope, the fragile beginning of something that might become love, that would endure long after the snow melted and the wind stopped howling. Sadie drifted off to sleep with her daughter in her arms, and Colt Ramsey sat vigil through the remainder of the storm, one hand resting on the rifle across his lap, the other tracing patterns in the firelight. Outside, the wind continued to scream, but it no longer sounded like death to him. It sounded like change. The baby changed everything, as babies have a way of doing. In the week following little Emma's dramatic arrival, Sadie had named her after her own mother. The cabin transformed from a place of bitter solitude into something that almost resembled a home. The change wasn't dramatic or sudden, but rather crept in like morning light, warming corners that had been cold for too long. Sadie discovered that Colt possessed unexpected domestic skills. While she recovered from the birth, he took over this cooking with the methodical precision of a man who'd spent years on cattle drives, where burned beans could mean the difference between a satisfied crew and a mutiny. His biscuits were dense but edible, his coffee strong enough to wake the dead, and his way with Emma both surprised and touched her. "You're good with her," Sadie observed one morning, watching from her bed as Colt held the baby in his lap, supporting her tiny head with hands that seemed too large and rough for such delicate work. "Babies are simple," he replied, his voice softer than usual. They want to be warm, fed, and safe. Everything else is just noise. It was a philosophy that seemed to guide his approach to fatherhood, for that's what he was becoming, whether either of them acknowledged it or not. When Emma cried in the night, he was often the first to respond, rolling his chair to Sadie's bedside and offering to take the baby so Sadie could rest. He fashioned a makeshift cradle from an old wooden crate, sanding it smooth and lining it with the softest cloth they could find. The most surprising discovery came on the third day after the storm, when Sadie found wood shavings scattered around Colt's chair and caught him quickly shoving something under a blanket. "What are you working on?" she asked, curious. "Nothing," he said, but his ears reddened slightly, and Sadie smiled at this first sign of embarrassment she'd seen from him. It wasn't until the following week that she discovered his secret project. Beautifully carved wooden rattle, shaped like a horse and polished to a warm golden sheen. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with delicate details that spoke of patience and skill. "When did you learn to carve?" she asked, turning the little horse over in her hands. "My father," Colt said simply. "Long winter evenings when I was a boy. He said a man's hands should know how to create as well as destroy." It was the first personal detail he'd shared about his past, and Sadie treasured it like a precious gift. She began to notice other signs of the man he'd been, the way he kept his guns clean and oiled, despite claiming he'd never use them again, the careful attention he paid to the weather, and the subtle changes in wind direction that might signal approaching danger. Dr. Hollis visited twice during Emma's first week, officially to check on the baby's health, but clearly also to satisfy his curiosity about the unlikely domestic arrangement. He found both mother and child thriving, though he seemed somewhat puzzled by the transformation he observed in Colt. "I've never seen him so engaged," the doctor confided to Sadie during his second visit, while Colt was outside checking their dwindling supply of firewood. "2 weeks ago, I couldn't get him to acknowledge my presence. Now he's asking intelligent questions about infant care and making suggestions for improving the cabin's ventilation. People change when they have something worth caring about," Sadie replied, watching through the window as Colt maneuvered his wheelchair across the uneven ground with newfound purpose. Martha Kellerman arrived the following day with a basket of supplies and a frank curiosity that she made no attempt to hide. She bustled into the cabin like a general inspecting troops, taking note of the cleaner living conditions, the smell of fresh bread from the kitchen, and the tiny bundle that was Emma sleeping peacefully in her handmade cradle. "Well, I'll be damned," Martha said, studying Colt with open amazement. "You look almost human again." "Thanks for the compliment," Colt replied dryly, but there was a hint of humor in his voice that hadn't been there before. Martha's visit served another purpose beyond social. She brought news from town that cast a shadow over their newfound domestic tranquility. Rumors had been circulating about increased raider activity in the surrounding territories. 3 settlements within 100 miles had been hit in the past month, and the pattern of attacks suggested the raiders were moving closer to Widow's Ridge. "Sheriff Brennan's doing his best," Martha explained, accepting a cup of coffee from Sadie, "but he's one man with a handful of part-time deputies. Most of the men in town are more interested in their drinking than in defending anything." Colt listened to this news with the focused attention of a professional soldier, and Sadie noticed how his questions revealed a tactical mind that had clearly not been dulled by his injury or his drinking. "What kind of numbers are we talking about?" he asked. "Hard to say. Survivors don't always give reliable counts when they're running scared. But the general consensus is maybe 20 to 30 men, well armed and mounted. Strategy? Hit fast, take what they can carry, burn the rest. They don't seem interested in holding territory, just in grabbing whatever's valuable and moving on." Colt was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant with calculation. "Any pattern to the timing? Moon phases? Weather conditions?" Martha raised an eyebrow. "You thinking of joining the fight, Colt Ramsey?" "Just trying to understand what we might be up against." After Martha left, Sadie found herself studying Colt with new eyes. The questions he'd asked hadn't been those of a curious civilian. They'd been the queries of someone with military or law enforcement experience, someone who understood tactics and strategy. "You weren't just a cowboy, were you?" She asked that evening as they sat by the fire, Emma nursing contentedly in her arms. Colt was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Finally, he spoke without looking at her. "I was a lot of things. Cowboy was just the most recent. What else?" Another long pause. Soldier, scout. Sometimes other things that didn't have nice names. Sadie waited, sensing there was more, but Colt's face had closed off again, returning to the careful blindness she'd learned to recognize as his defense against painful memories. The conversation might have ended there, but Emma chose that moment to finish nursing and let out a small, contented sigh that seemed to fill the cabin with warmth. Colt's expression softened as he watched the baby, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a vulnerability that made Sadie's chest tighten. "I used to be good at protecting people," he said quietly. "Made a living out of it, one way or another. Now I can't even protect myself." "You protected us," Sadie said firmly. "When Emma was born, when I needed help, you were there. You did everything that needed doing. That was different. That was just ... He gestured vaguely with one hand. "That was courage," Sadie interrupted. "The same courage that made you good at protecting people before. It's still there, Colt. It's just wearing different clothes." He looked at her then, really looked, and she saw something shift in his dark eyes, a crack in the wall he'd built around his heart. Small but significant. Their moment of connection was interrupted by a sound that had become familiar over the past week, Emma's tiny cry announcing that she needed changing or simply wanted attention. As Sadie rose to tend to her daughter, she noticed Colt's hands moving restlessly on the arms of his wheelchair, his eyes fixed on the rifles mounted on the cabin wall. That night, after Emma was settled and Sadie was preparing for bed, she found Colt still awake by the dying fire, staring into the flames with the intensity of a man trying to read his future in the embers. "Can't sleep?" she asked softly. "Too much thinking," he admitted. "These raiders Martha mentioned, they're not random bandits looking for easy pickings. The pattern she described, the tactics, it sounds organized, professional. Does that make them more dangerous? In some ways. But it also makes them predictable, if you know what to look for." He turned his chair to face her. "Sadie, I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly. If trouble comes to Widow's Ridge, what would you do?" The question caught her off guard. I don't know. Run, I suppose. Hide. With a week-old baby? In this weather?" He shook his head. "Running isn't always an option. Sometimes the only choice is to stand and fight. I wouldn't know how to fight. You might be surprised what you're capable of when someone threatens what you love." The word love hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that neither was quite ready to address directly. But Sadie understood what he was really saying, that Emma had given them both something worth defending, something that transformed abstract concepts of courage and sacrifice into immediate, personal necessities. "Would you teach me?" she asked impulsively. "If something did happen, I don't want to be helpless." Colt studied her face in the firelight, and she saw approval there, mixed with something that might have been respect. "Tomorrow," he said. "We'll start tomorrow." As Sadie settled into her bed that night, she could hear Colt moving around the main room, the soft squeak of his wheelchair wheels on the wooden floor as he made his final rounds of the cabin. She'd grown to find the sound comforting evidence that someone was watching over them, that they weren't alone in the vast darkness of the frontier night. Emma stirred in her cradle, making the small sounds of a baby dreaming, and Sadie reached out to touch the tiny hand that had curled into a perfect fist. Such small fingers, she thought, to have such power over the hearts of grown people. But babies had always been miraculous, that way capable of healing wounds that seemed beyond repair, of building bridges across distances that seemed unbridgeable. Outside, the wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying the scent of snow, and the promise of spring still months away. Inside the cabin, 3 unlikely souls had found each other in the wilderness, and for the first time since arriving in Widow's Ridge, Sadie allowed herself to imagine a future that extended beyond mere survival. It was a dangerous hope, she knew. Hope always was, in a place where winter could kill and men could be worse than wolves. But as she drifted off to sleep, lulled by the gentle sounds of Emma's breathing and the soft creak of Colt's chair as he settled in for his nightly vigil. Sadie found herself believing that some things, love, family, the fierce determination to protect what mattered, were stronger than fear. Some things were worth the risk of hoping. True to his word, Colt began Sadie's education the next morning. What started as basic instruction in handling firearms quickly evolved into something more comprehensive: lessons in awareness, in reading the signs that might mean the difference between safety and danger. First rule, he said, demonstrating how to properly hold his Colt .45. Never point a gun at anything you don't intend to destroy. Second rule, assume every gun is loaded, even when you know it isn't. Third rule. How many rules are there? Sadie interrupted, struggling to grip the heavy revolver with hands more accustomed to kneading dough than handling weapons. As many as it takes to keep you alive, Colt replied seriously. Your grip's too tight. You're trying to strangle the gun instead of controlling it. Relax your shoulders, breathe steady, and squeeze the trigger like you're trying to surprise it. They practiced with an unloaded weapon first, Colt patient and methodical as he corrected her stance and grip. Despite her initial awkwardness, Sadie proved to be a quick learner, and by the end of the first week, she could load, aim, and fire with reasonable accuracy. But the lessons extended beyond marksmanship. Colt taught her to listen for sounds that didn't belong, the snap of a twig that might mean someone was approaching, the sudden silence of birds that could indicate danger. He showed her how to move quietly, how to use shadows and cover, how to think like someone trying not to be seen. Why do you know all this? She asked one afternoon as they practiced moving silently around the cabin's perimeter. Emma was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, watched over by Martha, who had taken to stopping by daily with supplies and gossip. Because staying alive used to be my job, Colt answered, but his tone discouraged further questions. Sadie's education in Frontier survival coincided with her growing involvement in the life of Widow's Ridge. Word of Emma's birth had spread through the small community, and despite the questionable circumstances of her living arrangement, Sadie found herself gradually accepted by the town's women. It began with small gestures, Widow Henley stopping by with a jar of preserves, the blacksmith's wife bringing baby clothes. Her own children had outgrown. Dr. Hollis had been right about one thing. Sadie had a natural inclination to help others, and it wasn't long before people began seeking her out when they needed assistance. She helped deliver Mrs. Patterson's twins when the doctor was delayed treating an injured cowhand. She taught young Mary Henderson to read using the small collection of books she'd brought from her previous life. When old Pete Morrison fell ill with pneumonia, she spent 3 days nursing him back to health, bringing soup and staying up nights to monitor his breathing. Each act of kindness expanded her circle of influence and acceptance, but it also drew attention from elements in the town that weren't entirely friendly. Bull Garrison and his cronies watched her growing popularity with obvious displeasure, and more than once she caught them following her at a distance when she made her rounds. The confrontation, when it came, was almost anticlimactic in its inevitability. Sadie was returning from helping deliver medicine to the Morrison place when Bull stepped out from behind the general store, flanked by 2 of his usual companions. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows down the main street, and most of the townspeople had already retreated indoors for the evening meal. Well, well, Bull said, his voice carrying that familiar tone of lazy menace. If it ain't the town's new angel of mercy, how's that cripple treating you, Mrs. Quinn? Mr. Ramsey treats me with perfect respect, Sadie replied calmly, though her hand instinctively moved toward the small pistol Colt had insisted she carry. If you'll excuse me, I need to get home. Now, that's where you're wrong, Bull said, moving to block her path. See, you and me, we need to have us a talk about your ... circumstances. I can't imagine what circumstances of mine could possibly interest you. Bull's grin widened, showing those stained teeth. Oh, I think you can. Word is you're getting mighty cozy with that broken down has-been. Folks are starting to talk about what kind of woman shacks up with a cripple, if you know what I mean. Sadie felt heat rise in her cheeks, but kept her voice level. What people choose to gossip about says more about them than it does about me. Maybe so. But gossip has a way of spreading, and some of it might reach the wrong ears. Like maybe the territorial authorities who handle child welfare. Might be they'd be interested to hear about a bastard baby being raised in sin by a woman of questionable morals. The threat hit Sadie like a physical blow. The idea of losing Emma, of having her daughter taken away by authorities who might not understand or care about the true nature of her relationship with Colt, was her deepest fear. "What do you want?" she asked quietly. "Just a little cooperation. Nothing too demanding. Maybe you could convince your household to be a bit more generous with the local business community. Colt's got money put away, everyone knows that. And a woman with your talents could probably earn her keep in ways that don't involve playing nursemaid to invalids." The implication was clear and disgusting, and Sadie felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. "You're suggesting I become a prostitute to line your pockets?" "I'm suggesting you be practical about your situation. You're alone in the world with a baby to feed. That makes you vulnerable. But you could have protection, if you were willing to be reasonable." Before Sadie could respond, a new voice cut through the tension like a blade. The lady said, "Excuse me, Bull." That usually means the conversation's over. All four of them turned to see Colt rolling his wheelchair down the street toward them, moving with more speed and purpose than Sadie had ever seen from him. His face was set in lines of controlled fury, and even seated in his chair, he projected an aura of barely contained violence that made Bull's companions take an instinctive step backward. Well, Bull said, though his voice had lost some of its confidence. "Look what we got here. The cripple's come to rescue his woman." "That's right," Colt said, bringing his chair to a stop directly in front of Bull. "I have. And now you're going to apologize to Mrs. Quinn for your crude suggestions and walk away." Bull laughed, but it sounded forced. "Or what? You gonna run me down with that contraption?" Colt's hand moved with lightning speed, grasping Bull's shirt front and yanking him down until their faces were inches apart. Despite his paralyzed legs, his upper body strength was formidable, and Bull found himself pulled off balance and held there by an iron grip. "Listen carefully," Colt said, his voice deadly quiet. "I may not be able to walk, but I can still break your arm in 3 places before you could blink. And if I ever hear of you bothering Mrs. Quinn again, or threatening her child, or even looking at either of them wrong, I'll show you just how creative a man can get when he's truly motivated." He released Bull with a shove that sent the bigger man stumbling backward. "Now apologize to the lady and get out of my sight." Bull's face had gone pale, and Sadie could see the calculation in his eyes as he weighed his options. He was bigger, stronger, and had working legs, but something in Colt's manner suggested that attacking a man in a wheelchair might be the last mistake he ever made. "This ain't over," Bull muttered, but he was already backing away, his companions following suit. "Yes, it is," Colt replied with finality. "Walk away, Bull, while you still can." After the 3 men had disappeared around the corner of the saloon, Sadie found herself shaking with delayed reaction. The confrontation had escalated and resolved so quickly that she was still processing what had happened. "You didn't need to do that," she said, though her voice held gratitude rather than criticism. "I was handling it." "I know you were," Colt replied, and she was surprised by the pride in his voice. "But you shouldn't have to handle men like Bull Garrison alone. That's what partners do. They watch each other's backs." The word partners resonated between them, carrying implications that went beyond their practical living arrangement. They were partners now, Sadie realized, in raising Emma, in facing the challenges of frontier life, in the daily business of survival and hope. As they made their way back to the cabin together, Colt rolling alongside her as she walked, Sadie found herself seeing him with new eyes. The man who had confronted Bull wasn't the broken, bitter invalid she'd first encountered. This was someone dangerous and capable, someone who had chosen to use his remaining strength to protect what mattered to him. "That thing you did," she said as they approached their front door. "Grabbing Bull like that. Where did you learn to move so fast?" Colt was quiet for a moment. "You pick things up when your life depends on being quicker than the other fellow. You were a soldier." It wasn't a question, and Colt didn't treat it like one. Among other things. What other things? He stopped his chair at the base of the porch steps and looked up at her. Things that don't matter anymore. What matters is that you and Emma are safe, and that no one like Bull Garrison thinks he can threaten my family. My family. The words hung in the evening air like a promise, and Sadie felt something shift in her chest, a door opening, a wall coming down, a future becoming possible that she hadn't dared to imagine. Inside the cabin, Emma was awake and fussing, and Martha was walking her around the main room with the practiced ease of a woman who'd raised children of her own. "About time you two got back," Martha said, handing Emma to Sadie. This little one was asking for her mama. As Sadie settled into the rocking chair Colt had built for her, Emma immediately calmed, nuzzling against her mother's chest with the perfect trust that only babies possessed. Colt positioned his wheelchair nearby, close enough to touch Emma's tiny hand when she reached out, and Martha observed their domestic tableau with obvious satisfaction. "You know," Martha said, gathering her shawl, "when I first heard about this arrangement, I thought you were both crazy. A pregnant widow and a broken-down cowboy, what kind of life could come from that?" She paused at the door, looking back at them. "Turns out, sometimes crazy is exactly what the world needs. Sometimes broken things fit together in ways that make them stronger than they ever were whole." After Martha left, Sadie and Colt settled into their evening routine, she reading aloud from one of her books while he whittled or cleaned his guns, Emma sleeping peacefully in her cradle between them. It was domestic and comfortable and real, in a way that made Sadie's previous life seem like something she dreamed. "Colt," she said during a pause in her reading, "what Bull said today about the authorities and Emma, is that something I should worry about?" Colt looked up from the piece of wood he was carving. Another toy horse, she noticed, this one larger and more detailed than the rattle. "Not while I'm here," he said simply. "No one's taking Emma anywhere. I give you my word on that." It was a promise that carried weight, spoken by a man who had already proven he would fight to protect them. Sadie found herself believing him completely, trusting him with the most precious thing in her world. As the evening wore on and the fire burned low, she continued reading a collection of poetry that had belonged to her mother, verses about love and loss and the enduring strength of the human spirit. Colt listened with the attention of a man, discovering literature for the first time, occasionally asking her to repeat a particularly beautiful passage. When Emma stirred and needed feeding, Colt discreetly busied himself with other tasks, giving Sadie privacy while remaining close enough to help if needed. When the baby was settled again, he resumed his position by the fire, and they fell back into their comfortable routine of shared silence and gentle conversation. It was, Sadie thought as she finally prepared for bed, the kind of evening she'd dreamed about during those long, lonely nights in Deadwood, simple, peaceful, filled with the quiet satisfaction of a day well lived. The fact that it was happening in a frontier cabin with a paralyzed former soldier and her week-old daughter only proved that happiness could bloom in the most unlikely soil. As she settled Emma in the cradle and checked that the baby was warm and secure, Sadie caught sight of Colt through the doorway. He was sitting by the window, rifle across his lap, keeping watch over their small sanctuary. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. It always did on the frontier. But tonight they were safe and together and whole in all the ways that mattered. For a woman who had learned to expect little from life, it felt like everything. The turning point came on a crisp February morning when Dr. Hollis arrived at the cabin with news that would change everything. Sadie was outside hanging laundry, while Emma slept in her basket nearby, and Colt was working with the rehabilitation exercises the doctor had suggested, painful, repetitive movements designed to maintain what function remained in his damaged spine. "Colt," Dr. Hollis said without preamble, "I want to try something different today." Colt paused in his exercises, wiping sweat from his forehead with a towel. "More of the same isn't working, Doc. We both know that. That's exactly why. I want to try something new. There's a technique I learned during the war electrical stimulation therapy. It's experimental, but I've seen it help men with injuries similar to yours." Sadie approached from the clothesline, drawn by the serious tone of their conversation. "What kind of help?" Dr. Hollis adjusted his spectacles, choosing his words carefully. In some cases, very limited cases mind you, we've seen partial restoration of feeling and movement. Not a cure, I want to be clear about that, but sometimes enough improvement to make a significant difference in quality of life. Colt's expression was carefully neutral, but Sadie could see the flicker of hope he was trying to suppress. After 2 years of accepting his limitations, the possibility of improvement was both tantalizing and terrifying. What would it involve? Colt asked. Twice weekly sessions in my office. I have a new apparatus that generates controlled electrical current. We gradually increase the stimulation to your damaged nerves, combined with intensive physical therapy. It's not pleasant. The sensations can be quite painful, and there's no guarantee of success. But there's a chance? There's always a chance, Colt. The question is whether you're willing to endure the process on the possibility of limited improvement. Sadie watched Colt's face, seeing the internal struggle written in the tense lines around his eyes. For 2 years, he'd built his identity around being broken, around having lost the physical capabilities that had defined him. The prospect of change, even positive change, threatened that carefully constructed reality. I need to think about it, Colt said finally. That evening, as they sat by the fire with Emma sleeping peacefully between them, Sadie broached the subject again. You're afraid, she said gently. Of course I'm afraid, Colt replied, his honesty surprising them both. What if it doesn't work? What if it makes things worse? What if ... double quotes, he trailed off, staring into the flames. What if it works? Sadie finished for him. He looked at her sharply. You think that scares me? I think you've spent 2 years convincing yourself that this is who you are now. The idea of becoming someone different, even someone better, means letting go of the person you've been. Colt was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Maybe I don't deserve to get better. Why would you say that? Because you don't know who I really was, Sadie. Before the accident, before this. He gestured at his chair, his paralyzed legs. I wasn't a good man. I did things ... hurt. People ... So did I, Sadie said quietly. Colt looked at her in surprise. What? I wasn't always the respectable widow you think I am. Before Thomas, I worked in a saloon in Kansas City. Not serving drinks, serving men. I did what I had to do to survive, and I'm not proud of it. The confession hung between them like a bridge, two people acknowledging their imperfect pasts, their shared understanding of what desperation could drive a person to do. That doesn't change how I see you, Colt said finally. And your past doesn't change how I see you. We are who we choose to be now, Colt, not who we were. It took 3 more days for him to make his decision, but when he did, it was with the same determination he brought to everything that mattered. The first session with Dr. Hollis was torture. Sadie insisted on accompanying him, holding Emma while Colt gritted his teeth through the electrical stimulation that sent his damaged nerves into spasms of pain and sensation. But at the end of an hour, when Dr. Hollis asked him to try moving his right foot, Colt managed the barest twitch of movement. Did you see that? Dr. Hollis asked excitedly. I felt it, Colt whispered, staring down at his foot with wonder. I actually felt it. The progress was slow and painful. Some days brought breakthroughs, a stronger movement, a return of sensation to areas that had been numb for years. Other days brought frustration and setbacks that left Colt exhausted and discouraged. But Sadie was there for all of it, encouraging him through the difficult sessions, celebrating the small victories, holding him when the failures threatened to overwhelm his newfound hope. Their relationship deepened during this period in ways that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with partnership. They were a team now, united in the common goal of rebuilding not just Colt's body, but their shared future. Sadie took over more of the physical demands of their daily life, while Colt focused his energy on recovery and on the growing rumors of danger that continued to circulate through Widow's Ridge. The news from outside their small sanctuary grew increasingly ominous. 2 more settlements had been raided, and this time there were survivors with detailed descriptions of the attackers. They were well organized, well armed, and led by a man who seemed to know the territory intimately. More troubling, they appeared to be moving in a systematic pattern that would inevitably bring them to Widow's Ridge. "We need to start preparing the town," Colt said after Martha brought news of the latest attack. "These aren't random raids, this is military strategy." "The town won't listen," Martha replied. "Half the men are too drunk to care, and the other half are too scared to fight." "Then we make them care," Colt said grimly, "because running isn't an option, not with women and children involved." That afternoon, Colt did something he hadn't done in 2 years. He left the immediate vicinity of the cabin, with Sadie pushing. His wheelchair and Emma bundled against the cold. They made their way into town for the first time as a family. The reaction was everything Sadie had expected and worse. Conversation stopped when they appeared, replaced by stares and whispers. Some of the looks were merely curious, but others carried judgment and condemnation that made Sadie's cheeks burn with anger. But Colt seemed oblivious to the social undercurrents. He was focused on the practical aspects of defense sight lines, cover positions, weak points in the town's layout that could be exploited by attackers. "There," he said, pointing to the church bell tower that had stood silent since the preacher. "Left, perfect vantage point for a lookout. And if we could get some of these men organized, we could set up crossfire positions here and here." He was talking to Sheriff Brennan, who had approached them outside the general store with the wary respect of a man who recognized competence when he saw it. "You think they'll really hit us?" Brennan asked. "I think we'd be foolish to assume they won't. The question is whether we're going to be ready for them." Over the following weeks, Colt began the delicate process of organizing Widow's Ridge's defenses. It required all his diplomatic skills, what remained of them, to convince a collection of stubborn, independent frontiersmen to work together toward a common goal. Some were receptive to his leadership. Men who remembered his reputation from before the accident were willing to listen when he outlined defensive strategies and training schedules. Others, particularly those in Bull Garrison's circle, viewed his efforts with suspicion and resentment. Who made him the general? Bull complained loudly enough for half the saloon to hear. "Man can't even walk, but he wants to tell the rest of us how to fight." The criticism stung, but Colt persevered. Every afternoon he held informal training sessions in the field behind the church, teaching basic military tactics to anyone willing to learn. Sadie often accompanied him, with Emma in her arms, and gradually she noticed a change in how the townspeople regarded their unconventional family. It started with the women. Perhaps it was maternal sympathy for another mother, or perhaps it was recognition of the practical value of Colt's knowledge. But one by one, the women of Widow's Ridge began to acknowledge Sadie's presence with nods and small smiles. Mrs. Patterson brought Emma a hand-knitted cap. Widow Henley offered advice about teething remedies. Even the stern-faced wife of the blacksmith began greeting Sadie by name. The men took longer to come around, but Colt's competence was difficult to deny. When he organized a successful defense against a pack of wolves that had been threatening the town's livestock, even some of his harshest critics had to admit his value. The breakthrough came during his 4th week of training sessions. When Young, Tommy Morrison, old Pete's grandson, asked a question that cut to the heart of everyone's concerns. "Mr. Ramsey, if these raiders do come, and if they're as organized as you say, what makes you think we can stop them?" Colt was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of hard-won experience. "Because, son, fighting isn't just about who's stronger or faster or has better weapons. It's about who has more to lose. Those raiders, they're fighting for profit. We're fighting for our homes, our families, our lives. That makes all the difference." He looked around at the assembled faces, farmers and shopkeepers, young men and old, united by their shared investment in the community they built together. "I won't lie to you," he continued. "If they come, some of us might not survive. But if we don't fight, none of us will. And I'd rather die protecting what I love than live knowing I ran at most." It was a speech that resonated deeply with men who had chosen the frontier life, precisely because they valued independence and self-determination above safety and comfort. When the training session ended that day, Colt had more volunteers than he'd ever had before. That evening, as they settled into their familiar routine by the fire, Sadie reflected on the transformation she'd witnessed, not just in Colt's physical recovery, but in his emergence as a leader worth following. "You're becoming yourself again," she observed as she nursed Emma. "No," Colt replied, looking up from the detailed defense plans he was sketching. "I'm becoming someone new. Someone better. I hope. Better how?" He set down his pencil and looked at her directly. "The man I was before cared about winning. This man cares about protecting. The difference might seem small, but it changes everything." Outside, the wind carried the scent of coming spring, though winter still held the territory in its grip. Inside their cabin, 3 people who had found each other in the darkness were building something worth defending. Not just a home, but a future filled with the kind of love that made even impossible dreams seem achievable. The raids would come eventually. They all knew that. Tonight, they were together and safe and whole in all the ways that mattered. For people who had learned to treasure the present moment over uncertain tomorrows, it was enough. More than enough. It was everything. Spring arrived early that year, bringing with it both hope and an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate every conversation in Widow's Ridge. The snow melted in great rushing torrents that turned the main street into a muddy river, and the air carried the green scent of new growth, mixing with the lingering chill of winter's retreat. For Colt, the changing season marked a milestone in his recovery that even Dr. Hollis hadn't dared predict. During their twice-weekly sessions, the electrical stimulation therapy had gradually restored sensation to his lower body, and with it came the tantalizing possibility of something approaching normal movement the day he first stood upright even. Briefly, even with assistance, was burned forever into Sadie's memory. She had been feeding Emma in Dr. Hollis's office, waiting for Colt's treatment to conclude, when she heard a sharp intake of breath from the examination room. "Sadie," Colt called, his voice tight with emotion. "Sadie, come here." She found him, gripping the parallel bars Dr. Hollis had installed for physical therapy, his legs trembling with the effort of supporting his weight, but unmistakably, undeniably standing. Tears were streaming down his face, tears of joy, of relief, of possibilities he'd thought lost forever. "Look at me," he whispered. "Just look at me." Emma chose that moment to reach out with her tiny hands toward this tall man who was usually seated when she saw him, and her gurgling laugh filled the room with pure delight. It was as if she understood the significance of what she was witnessing, her world expanding to include new possibilities, new ways of being a family. But the victory was tempered by sobering news from the outside world. Sheriff Brennan had received word through the territorial telegraph that the raiders had struck again, this time hitting a settlement only 30 miles southeast of Widow's Ridge. The attack had been particularly vicious, leaving few survivors and following the now familiar pattern of systematic destruction. "They're getting bolder," Colt observed that evening as he studied the reports Brennan had shared. His legs were wrapped in the warm compresses Dr. Hollis had prescribed, and though he was back in his wheelchair, the knowledge that he could stand, however, briefly had changed something fundamental in his bearing. "How much time do you think we have?" Sadie asked, bouncing Emma gently as the baby fussed through what had become her regular evening restlessness. "Hard to say. If they maintain their current pattern, maybe 2 weeks. Maybe less if the weather holds and travel becomes easier." Sadie studied his face in the firelight, noting the return of something she hadn't seen since those first bitter days, the look of a man preparing for war. "You're planning something." "I'm planning everything," he admitted. "Every scenario, every possibility. If they come, we need to be ready." Over the following days, Colt's preparations took on an urgency that infected the entire town. His training sessions became more intensive, focused on practical skills rather than theory. He taught the men of Widow's Ridge how to move quietly, how to coordinate their fire, how to use the terrain to their advantage. But it was his work with the women that surprised everyone, including Sadie, recognizing that traditional gender roles might prove fatal in a crisis. Colt began teaching basic defensive skills to any woman willing to learn. Martha proved to be a natural with a rifle, her steady hands and sharp eyes making her one of the town's best marksmen. Widow Henley, despite her age, demonstrated an uncanny ability to move silently and observe without being seen. "You realize what you're doing, don't you? Sadie asked one evening after returning from a particularly intensive training session. Teaching people to defend themselves? Teaching people to be more than they thought they could be. You're giving them permission to be brave. Colt considered this as he worked the muscles in his legs, the exercises that were gradually restoring strength and mobility to his damaged body. Maybe that's what we all need sometimes, permission to be more than our circumstances suggest we should be. It was during this period of intense preparation that Colt finally shared the complete truth about his past. The conversation began, as many of their most important talks did, in the quiet intimacy of evening, with Emma sleeping peacefully between them and the fire casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls. I wasn't just a soldier, he began without preamble, his voice carrying the weight of long-held secrets. I was a marshal, federal marshal, working undercover in the mining territories. Sadie set down her mending and gave him her full attention. Undercover doing what? Investigating corruption. The mining companies were in league with territorial officials, systematically cheating homesteaders and small-time miners out of their claims. When people complained or tried to fight back, they had a tendency to disappear. And your accident? Colt's laugh was bitter. Wasn't an accident. I got too close to exposing the whole operation, so they decided to eliminate me. The mine collapse was staged meant to kill me outright. The fact that I survived was just bad luck, from their perspective. The revelation reframed everything. Sadie thought she knew about his injury, his bitterness, his retreat from the world. He hadn't just lost his physical capabilities. He'd lost his mission, his identity as someone who fought for justice. Why are you telling me this now? She asked. Because these raiders, they're not random bandits. The pattern of their attacks, the systematic way they're moving through the territory, the fact that they seem to know exactly which settlements have what resources. He met her eyes directly. I think they're connected to the same corruption. I was investigating, and I think they know I'm here. The implications hit Sadie like a physical blow. You think they're coming for you specifically? I think Widow's Ridge was always going to be a target. But yes, I think my presence here makes it more urgent for them. Then we should leave. Take Emma and go somewhere safe. Colt shook his head firmly. Running won't solve anything. They'll find me eventually, and next time I might not have a community of good people willing to stand with me. Besides, he looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in her cradle. This is our home now. These are our people. We don't abandon family. Family. The word carried more weight each time he used it, encompassing not just their little trio, but the entire community of Widow's Ridge. They had put down roots here, built relationships, created something worth defending. What do you need from me? Sadie asked, because that's what partners did. They faced the hard decisions together. I need you to learn everything I can teach you about survival, about fighting, about protecting Emma if something happens to me. And I need you to trust me when the time comes, even if my decisions don't make sense in the moment. Over the following week, Sadie's education in frontier warfare intensified. Colt taught her to shoot with deadly accuracy, to move through the wilderness without leaving tracks, to read the subtle signs that might indicate approaching danger. More importantly, he taught her to think tactically, to always have an escape plan, to prioritize Emma's safety above all other considerations. The lessons took place in the early mornings, before the town was awake, with Emma sleeping peacefully. In a basket they carried with them. Sadie proved to be an apt pupil. Her natural intelligence and fierce protective instincts combining to make her surprisingly formidable. You're better at this than you think, Colt observed after she successfully completed a complex stalking exercise. You have the patience for it, and the focus. Most people can't quiet their minds enough to truly listen to what the world is telling them. I had a good teacher, Sadie replied, but she was beginning to understand that she possessed capabilities she'd never been required to develop. Motherhood had awakened something primal in her, a willingness to do whatever was necessary to protect her child. Their growing intimacy during this period extended beyond the practical necessities of preparation and defense. As Colt's physical recovery continued, and as the shared challenges of their situation drew them closer together, the emotional walls they both maintained began to crumble. It started with small moments, Colt's hand lingering on hers when she helped him with his exercises, Sadie's gentle touch when she tended to his still healing injuries. But it was the night Emma ran her first fever that their relationship finally crossed the line from partnership to something deeper, the baby's. Illness struck suddenly, transforming her from a happy, gurgling infant into a listless, burning bundle of misery. Sadie was beside herself with worry, having never dealt with a sick child before, and even Dr. Hollis seemed concerned about the rapid onset of symptoms. "Keep her cool, keep her hydrated, and watch her breathing," he instructed, but Sadie could see the worry in his eyes. Infant mortality was high on the frontier, and even minor illnesses could prove fatal without proper medical care. Colt took charge with the calm efficiency of a man accustomed to crisis. He helped Sadie bathe Emma in lukewarm water to bring down her fever, held the baby when Sadie's hands shook too badly to be useful, and maintained a steady stream of reassuring conversation that kept both mother and child as calm as possible. When Emma's fever finally broke in the early hours of the morning, Sadie collapsed into Colt's arms with relief and exhaustion. He held her as she cried, his strong hand stroking her hair, his voice murmuring words of comfort and reassurance. "I was so scared," she whispered against his chest. "I couldn't bear to lose her." "You won't," he said firmly. "I won't let that happen. I promise you, Sadie, whatever comes, Emma will be safe. You both will." When she finally pulled back to look at him, something had changed in the space between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite boundaries of their unconventional arrangement, had dissolved completely. They were no longer two damaged people sharing space out of necessity. They were a family, bound together by love and commitment, and the fierce determination to protect what they'd built together. "Colt," she began, but he silenced her with a gentle finger against her lips. "I know," he said softly. "I feel it too. And when this is over, when we've dealt with whatever's coming, we'll talk about what it means. But for now, let's just be grateful that we found each other." As dawn broke over Widow's Ridge, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Sadie and Colt sat together watching their daughter sleep peacefully in her cradle. Emma's fever was gone, her breathing easy and natural, her tiny face relaxed in a perfect trust that only babies possessed. Outside, the world was waking up to another day of preparation and uncertainty. But inside their cabin, three souls who had found each other in the darkness were drawing strength from their connection, preparing to face whatever challenges lay ahead with the unshakable conviction that love in all its forms was worth fighting for. The raiders would come eventually. They all knew that now. But they would find a community united not just by fear, but by hope, led by a man who had learned that true strength came not from the ability to walk, but from the willingness to stand up for what mattered most. And what mattered most was sleeping peacefully in a hand-carved cradle, surrounded by parents who would move heaven and earth to keep her safe. The truth came to light on a morning when the spring sunshine should have promised nothing but hope. Sadie was cleaning out Colt's old saddlebags, task she'd been putting off for months, when her fingers encountered something that made her blood run cold. Hidden in a secret compartment she'd discovered by accident was a tarnished silver badge, its surface worn smooth by years of handling. But it wasn't just any badge. It was a United States Marshal star, and engraved on the back in careful script were the words, "Deputy Marshal Colt Ramsey, Territory of Dakota." The saddlebags yielded other secrets, official correspondence, bearing federal seals, detailed reports in Colt's careful handwriting, and a photograph that made Sadie's hands tremble. The image showed a younger Colt in a formal uniform, standing beside a group of men in suits. Territorial officials, she realized, some of whom she recognized from newspaper illustrations. But it was the documents that truly shattered her understanding of who Colt had been. Detailed investigations into mining company corruption, witness testimonies from families who'd been cheated out of their claims, and most damning of all, a list of names that included several men she knew were dead killed in accidents that bore suspicious similarities to Colt's own supposed mishap. "Find something interesting?" Sadie spun around to find Colt in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he balanced on the primitive crutches Dr. Hollis had fashioned for him. His mobility had improved dramatically over the past month, though. He still relied on his wheelchair for longer distances. "You weren't just investigating corruption," Sadie said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You were building a case that could have brought down the entire territorial government." Colt moved into the room with careful steps, settling into his wheelchair with the ease of long practice. "And getting close to witnesses who were willing to testify. That's what made me dangerous enough to kill. These names on your list, all dead now. Accidents, of course. Mine collapses, hunting mishaps, sudden illnesses. Very convenient for certain people in high places." Sadie sank onto the bed, the weight of revelation making her legs unsteady. "But you survived. They failed to kill you." "Barely. And the man who walked into that mine isn't the same one who was carried out." His voice carried a bitterness she hadn't heard in months. "Marshal Colt Ramsey died in that collapse, along with his investigation and any hope of justice for the families who were cheated. That's not true, isn't it? Look at me, Sadie. I'm a cripple who can barely stand, let alone pursue dangerous men across hostile territory. My badge, my authority, my ability to act, all of it died with my legs." Sadie stood and moved to where he sat, kneeling beside his chair so their eyes were level. "Your badge is just metal. Your authority came from your commitment to justice. And your ability to act." She gestured around the cabin, toward the window where they could see townspeople moving through their daily routines. "You've organized an entire community to defend itself. You've turned farmers and shopkeepers into soldiers. How is that not acting?" Before Colt could respond, the sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. But these weren't the familiar sounds of townspeople going about their business. This was the disciplined cadence of trained riders, moving with military precision. Colt's entire demeanor changed instantly, the bitter introspection replaced by alert watchfulness. "Get Emma," he said tersely. "Now." Sadie didn't question the order. She hurried to the main room where Emma was sleeping peacefully in her cradle, scooping up the baby, along with the emergency bag they prepared weeks earlier. By the time she returned, Colt had armed himself and positioned his wheelchair near the window, where he could observe the approaching riders without being seen. "How many?" Sadie asked quietly. "3. But they're scouts. There will be more nearby." His voice carried the professional calm of a man accustomed to dangerous situations. "They're not attacking yet, just getting the lay of the land." Through the window, Sadie could see the riders moving slowly through the town, their eyes cataloging defensive positions, escape routes, and potential obstacles. They were well armed and well mounted, with the easy confidence of men who'd done this many times before. "Do you recognize any of them?" Colt studied the faces carefully, his expression growing grim. "The one in front, that's Jake Morrison. He was a deputy sheriff when I started my investigation. Obviously, he's found more lucrative employment." "Someone you arrested? Someone I trusted?" The words carried a weight of betrayal that made Sadie's heart ache for him. He knew about my investigation, knew the identities of my witnesses. When people started dying, I suspected there was a leak, but I never imagined. The riders completed their circuit of the town and departed as quietly as they'd arrived, but their presence had transformed the morning from peaceful routine to imminent danger. Colt immediately began issuing orders with the authority of a man born to command. "Get word to Sheriff Brennan," he told Sadie. "Tell him to implement the emergency plan immediately. Then find Martha and ask her to spread the word to the other women. They need to gather the children and elderly in the most defensible buildings. What about you?" "I'm going to do what I should have done 2 years ago." He reached for the marshal's badge, pinning it to his shirt with hands that showed no trace of trembling. "I'm going to finish this investigation." The transformation was remarkable. As soon as the star was in place, Colt seemed to shed years of defeat and self-doubt. This was Marshal Colt Ramsey, a man who'd built his reputation on being faster, smarter, and more determined than the criminals he pursued. "Sadie," he said, his voice gentle but urgent, "I need you to understand something. When they come, and they will come probably before nightfall, this won't be a raid for supplies or money. This is personal. They're here to eliminate the last witness to their crimes. Then we run." Take Emma and leave now before. No. The word was final, carrying the authority of both a lawman and a man protecting his family. Running just delays the inevitable. They'll follow us, and next time we might not have the advantage of prepared ground and good people willing to fight. He gripped her hands, his eyes intense with the need to make her understand. This is our chance to end it. Not just for us, but for all the families who've been murdered, all the communities that have been destroyed. If we can capture Morrison and make him talk, we can expose the entire conspiracy. And if we can't, then at least Emma will grow up in a world where good people stood up to evil, instead of running from it. The next few hours passed in a blur. A frantic preparation. The emergency plan Colt had developed proved its worth as the townspeople of Widow's Ridge transformed their community into a fortress. Barricades appeared across the main street, constructed from overturned wagons and furniture. Windows were boarded up, except for carefully positioned firing ports. Non-combatants gathered in the church and the doctor's office, the two most defensible buildings in town, but it was the people themselves who provided the most remarkable transformation. Men who'd spent months grumbling about Colt's training. Sessions now moved with purpose and confidence, checking weapons and coordinating fields of fire. Women who'd never held a rifle in anger took positions at strategic points, their faces set with the determination of mothers protecting their children. Doctor Hollis established a field hospital in his office, preparing for the casualties that were almost inevitable. Martha turned the saloon into a command post, its elevated position providing excellent observation of the surrounding countryside. Even Widow Henley, despite her advanced age, insisted on taking a position where she could help relay messages. Between defensive positions. As the sun reached its zenith, Colt called his defenders together for final instructions. Standing with the aid of his crutches, he addressed the assembled townspeople with the quiet authority that had made him a legend in law enforcement circles. "They'll come with the setting sun," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. "They want the light behind them and shadows to hide their numbers. When they do come, remember your training. Stay calm, conserve your ammunition, and trust the person fighting beside you." He paused, his eyes finding Sadie in the crowd. She stood near the church steps with Emma in her arms, surrounded by the other women who'd volunteered for the most. Dangerous assignment of all protecting the children if the outer defenses failed. "Some of you are wondering why we're doing this," Colt continued. "Why we're risking everything to fight men who might leave us alone if we just gave them what they wanted. The answer is simple, because giving in to evil doesn't make it go away. It just makes it stronger." His voice grew stronger, carrying the passion of a man who dedicated his life to justice. "These men have murdered entire families, destroyed communities, stolen the dreams of honest people trying to build something better. They think they can intimidate us because they've never faced people who truly understood what they were fighting for." He straightened, the silver star on his chest catching the afternoon sunlight. "They're about to learn the difference between people fighting for profit and people fighting for home." As the defenders dispersed to their positions, Sadie approached, Colt with Emma still in her arms. The baby was awake and alert, her bright eyes taking in the unusual activity around her with the curious fearlessness of the very young. "I want you to know," Sadie said quietly, "that whatever happens today, these months with you have been the happiest of my life. You and Emma, you're my family, my real family." Colt reached out to touch Emma's tiny hand, his weathered fingers gentle against her soft skin. "And you've given me something? I thought I'd lost forever a reason to believe that broken things can be made whole again." They stood together for a moment, a family united by love and commitment, drawing strength from their connection for the battle ahead. Then, with the sun beginning its descent toward the western horizon, they took their positions and waited for the storm to break. In the distance, dust clouds appeared on the horizon riders approaching with the inexorable certainty of fate. But Widow's Ridge was ready, transformed from a collection of struggling individuals into a community prepared to defend what they'd built together. Marshall, Colt Ramsey checked his weapons one final time and settled into the custom fighting chair Dr. Hollis had designed for him, a modified wheelchair that provided mobility while allowing him to use his firearms effectively. After 2 years of believing his career was over, he was about to discover that some battles were worth fighting regardless of physical limitations. The raiders were coming, but they would find something they hadn't expected, a town full of people who refused to be victims, led by a man who'd learned that true strength came not from the ability to walk, but from the willingness to stand up for what was right. Justice, it seemed, was about to make a long overdue appearance in Widow's Ridge. Raiders arrived with the setting sun, just as Colt had predicted. 27 mounted men approached Widow's Ridge in a formation that spoke of military training and battlefield experience. They rode with the casual confidence of predators who'd grown accustomed to easy prey, but as they drew closer to the town's outskirts, their leader, a man Sadie now recognized as Jake Morrison, raised his hand in a signal that brought the entire group to a halt. From his position behind the reinforced barricades at the town's main entrance, Colt observed this raiders through a pair of field glasses Dr. Hollis had provided. What he saw confirmed his worst fears and best hopes simultaneously. "They know something's different," he murmured to Sheriff Brennan, who was positioned nearby with a rifle that had seen better days, but was still capable of accurate fire. "Look at their formation. They're confused by the preparations." Indeed, the raiders seemed taken aback by the sight of a town that had clearly prepared for their arrival. Instead of scattered buildings occupied by helpless civilians, they faced coordinated defensive positions and the unmistakable signs of organized resistance. Morrison urged his horse forward, stopping just outside rifle range. When he spoke, his voice carried easily across the distance, amplified by the peculiar acoustics of the approaching evening. "People of Widow's Ridge," he called, his tone suggesting a man accustomed to being obeyed. "I'm Jake Morrison, and these are my associates. We're here on official business, investigating reports of criminal activity in your community." From behind the church bell tower where she'd positioned herself with Emma and several other women, Sadie felt her blood boil at the man's audacity. To present himself as a lawman while leading a band of killers and thieves was an insult to every honest person who'd ever worn a badge. Colt's response was immediate and uncompromising. Rolling his fighting chair forward until he was visible to the raiders, he called back with all the authority of his federal commission. "This is United States Marshal Colt Ramsey. You and your men are trespassing on federal territory, and you're under arrest for multiple counts of murder, theft, and conspiracy." The effect of his words was electric. Several of the raiders shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly recognizing the name, even if they'd believed the man was dead. Morrison himself seemed stunned, his confident demeanor cracking as he stared at the figure in the wheelchair. "Impossible," Morrison shouted back. "Colt Ramsey died in a mining accident 2 years ago." "Reports of my death," Colt replied with grim humor, "have been greatly exaggerated, just like your authority to terrorize these people." For a long moment, the two groups faced each other across the dusty expanse that separated the town from the open prairie. Then Morrison's shock transformed into something much more dangerous, the desperate fury of a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around him. "Kill them all," he screamed to his men. "Leave no witnesses." The battle erupted with the suddenness of a prairie thunderstorm. The raiders charged forward with savage determination, but they immediately discovered that Widow's Ridge had teeth. The carefully positioned defenders opened fire with devastating effect, their weeks of training evident in the accuracy and coordination of their response. From the church tower, Martha Kellerman's rifle spoke with deadly precision, dropping the lead rider before he'd covered half the distance to the barricades. The blacksmith and his sons, positioned behind an overturned wagon, created a devastating crossfire that turned the main street into a killing ground. But the raiders were experienced fighters, and after the initial shock of organized resistance, they adapted quickly to the new situation. Under Morrison's shouted orders, they split into smaller groups, some dismounting to take cover while others circled wide to attack the town's flanks. Colt found himself in the center of a maelstrom that tested every skill he'd ever learned as a lawman and soldier. His modified fighting chair allowed him unexpected mobility, and his intimate knowledge of the town's layout gave him advantages that offset his physical limitations. When raiders tried to breach the main barricade, his rifle fire drove them back. When they attempted to flank the position, he was there to meet them with devastating accuracy. "Behind you!" Sheriff Brennan called out, and Colt spun his chair to see 3 raiders who'd managed to work their way between the buildings. His Colt .45 spoke twice, dropping 2 of the attackers, while Brennan's rifle accounted for the 3rd. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably less than 30 minutes. The defenders' superior positions and coordinated fire took a terrible toll on the raiders, but the cost was mounting on both sides. Young Tommy Morrison, old Pete's grandson, took a bullet in the shoulder while manning the position near the blacksmith shop. Doc Hollis himself was grazed by a ricochet while treating the wounded in his makeshift field hospital. It was during this intense phase of the fighting that Colt made a decision that would define the rest of his life. Observing that Morrison had taken cover behind a water trough near the saloon, he realized that the raider leader was in a position to escape if the battle turned against his forces. More importantly, Morrison was the key to exposing the corruption that had destroyed so many lives. He couldn't be allowed to disappear into the territory's vast wilderness. "Brennan," Colt called to the sheriff. "I'm going after Morrison." "Hold. The line here." "Colt, no," Brennan protested. "It's too dangerous. Let him run. We've won this fight." "We've won the battle," Colt replied grimly, "but not the war. Morrison has the names, the connections, the evidence we need to clean up this territory once and for all." Before anyone could stop him, Colt had rolled his fighting chair out from behind the barricades and was moving directly toward Morrison's position. It was an act of such obvious courage or madness that the fighting actually paused for a moment as both sides tried to process what they were seeing. A paralyzed man in a wheelchair, rolling directly into the line of fire to confront the leader of a gang of killers. Morrison saw him coming and raised his rifle. But something in Colt's approach, the absolute certainty of a man who'd accepted whatever consequences might follow, seemed to unnerve him. His shot went wide, and before he could fire again, Colt was close enough to make conversation possible. "It's over, Jake," Colt said, his voice carrying clearly in the sudden quiet. "Your men are dying, your operation is exposed, and I'm still alive to testify against everyone involved." "You're a cripple," Morrison snarled, though his voice lacked conviction. "You can't even stand up, let alone arrest me. Watch me." To Morrison's apparent amazement, Colt began to rise from his wheelchair. It was painful, uncertain, requiring tremendous effort, but unmistakably real. The man who'd been written off as permanently disabled was standing upright, badge gleaming on his chest, rifle steady in his hands. "United States Marshal Colt Ramsey," he said formally. "Jake Morrison, you're under arrest for murder, conspiracy, and violations of federal law. Surrender your weapons and submit to lawful authority." For a moment, it seemed as if Morrison might comply. The sight of Colt standing, however shakily, seemed to break something in the raider leader's spirit. But then desperation overcame shock, and Morrison made a grab for his sidearm. He was fast, but Colt was faster. The marshal's rifle spoke once, and Morrison crumpled to the ground, his weapon unfired in his hand. The remaining raiders, seeing their leader fall and facing the impossible sight of a dead federal marshal standing in judgment over them, lost what remained of their fighting spirit. Some threw down their weapons and raised their hands. Others attempted to flee, only to be cut down by the defenders who'd found new inspiration in their leader's courage. When the smoke finally cleared and the last echoes of gunfire faded across the prairie, Widow's Ridge stood victorious. The cost had been heavy: 3 men dead, several wounded, and damage to buildings that would take months to repair. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had proven that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary evil when they stood together. Colt remained upright for perhaps 30 seconds after Morrison fell, long enough for everyone to witness his moment of triumph. Then his strength gave out, and he collapsed back into his wheelchair, exhausted but victorious. Sadie reached him first, having left her position in the church tower the moment the shooting stopped. Emma was crying. The sound of gunfire had frightened her. But she calmed instantly when she saw her parents together and apparently unharmed. "You stood up," Sadie said, tears streaming down her face. "You actually stood up." "For about as long as it took to arrest Morrison," Colt replied with a tired smile, "but long enough." Dr. Hollis arrived to check on his patient, his medical bag in one hand and an expression of professional amazement on his face. "Colt, what you just did should have been impossible. The stress on your healing spine, the risk of permanent damage, was worth it," Colt interrupted. "Some things are worth any risk." As the townspeople of Widow's Ridge gathered around their unlikely hero, someone began to cheer. The sound spread quickly, growing into a celebration that echoed across the prairie like a declaration of victory over forces that had terrorized the territory for too long. Sheriff Brennan approached with a leather satchel he'd recovered from Morrison's horse. "Colt, you need to see this. Evidence, names, dates, financial records. Enough to expose the entire conspiracy and maybe bring some real justice to this territory." Colt accepted the satchel with hands that were still trembling from exhaustion and adrenaline. Inside were documents that confirmed his worst suspicions, a network of corruption that extended from local officials to territorial governors, all coordinated through the systematic elimination of anyone who threatened their profitable arrangement. "It's all here," he said wonderingly. "Everything we need to clean house from here to Washington." But as important as the documents were, Colt found his attention drawn to more immediate concerns. Emma had stopped crying and was looking up at him with the bright, curious gaze that never failed to melt his heart. Sadie was pressed against his side, her warmth a reminder of all the reasons he'd fought so hard to protect this community. Around them, the people of Widow's Ridge were beginning the process of treating the wounded and securing the prisoners. They moved with the confidence of people who discovered their own strength, who'd learned that they were capable of more than they'd ever imagined. As the sun finally disappeared behind the western mountains, casting long shadows across the battlefield that had once been their peaceful main street, Colt reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. 2 years ago, he'd been a broken man convinced that his usefulness was at an end. Now he was surrounded by family and community, having just completed the most important arrest of his career. The documents in Morrison's satchel would indeed bring justice to the territory. But the real victory wasn't in the evidence they'd recovered or the criminals they captured. It was in the proof that broken things could be made whole, that love could triumph over despair, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought not for glory or profit, but for the simple right to build something good in a harsh world. Marshal Colt Ramsey was back, and the territory would never be the same. The final confrontation came not with the dramatic violence of the main battle, but in the quiet aftermath, when the hardest truths demanded to be spoken. As the townspeople of Widow's Ridge tended their wounded and secured their prisoners, Colt found himself face to face with the man who had orchestrated years of suffering across the Dakota Territory. Jake Morrison lay wounded, but conscious near the water trough where he'd fallen, Dr. Hollis working methodically to stabilize his condition. Despite the man's crimes, the bullet from Colt's rifle had shattered Morrison's shoulder, ensuring he wouldn't be escaping, but leaving him very much alive to answer for his actions. "Why?" Colt asked simply, rolling his wheelchair close enough for private conversation while Sadie remained nearby with Emma. "We were friends, Jake. I trusted you with my life, with the lives of innocent people. Why did you betray everything we swore to protect?" Morrison's laugh was bitter, tinged with pain and the peculiar freedom that came with having nothing left to lose. "Friends? You self-righteous bastard. You never understood what friendship meant out here. You thought law and order could fix everything, that justice mattered more than survival." "Justice does matter more than survival," says the man who survived while good people died because of his investigation. Morrison's eyes held a malice that seemed to burn despite his weakened condition. "How many families got killed because you stirred up the hornet's nest? How many communities got wiped out because you couldn't leave well enough alone?" The accusation hit Colt like a physical blow, striking at the guilt he'd carried for 2 years. But Sadie's gentle hand on his shoulder reminded him that guilt and responsibility were different things, and that the choices of evil men couldn't be laid at the feet of those who opposed them. Those people died because criminals like you murdered them, Colt replied steadily. Not because I tried to stop you. Keep telling yourself that. Morrison winced as Dr. Hollis probed his wound, but his voice remained venomous. You want to know the truth about your precious investigation? You want to know why it was so easy to eliminate your witnesses? Despite himself, Colt leaned forward. The need to understand, to finally close the books on the case that had defined and nearly destroyed his life, overcame his better judgment. Morrison's smile was cruel. Because half of them were already working for us. Your honest homesteaders. And victimized miners. They were feeding us information about federal interest in the territory. The mining companies paid better than you ever could, Marshal. A lot better. The revelation struck Colt like lightning, reframing everything he thought he knew about his investigation. The witnesses who died in accidents, had they been eliminated, to silence them, or to prevent them from revealing their own complicity. The families who'd welcomed him into their homes, who'd shared their stories of victimization. How many had been playing roles for pay? You're lying, Sadie said fiercely, speaking for the first time since Morrison had begun his confessions. You're trying to destroy his faith in the good he's done. Am I? Morrison's gaze shifted to her with obvious malice. Ask your precious Marshal about the Henderson family. Sweet little homesteaders with 3 children and a mortgage they couldn't pay. They came to him with tales of being cheated out of their mining claims, and he believed every word. Colt's face had gone pale, but he said nothing. The Hendersons were on our payroll for 6 months before they ever met your husband, Morrison continued to Sadie. Everything they told him was carefully crafted to lead him exactly where we wanted him to go. And when they outlived their usefulness ... That's enough, Dr. Hollis interrupted sharply. This man needs medical attention, not an interrogation. But Morrison wasn't finished. Despite his weakened condition, he seemed energized by the pain he was inflicting on his old friend. The mine collapse that crippled you? The Hendersons told us exactly when you'd be there, exactly which tunnel you'd be inspecting. They even helped us set the charges. The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, the sounds of the town. Cleaning up after battle, continued voices calling out, the scrape of debris being moved, the nervous laughter of people who'd survived something terrible. But in their small circle, time seemed frozen as the implications of Morrison's words sank in. Colt's hands were trembling now, not from exhaustion, but from the magnitude of what he was learning. The family he'd died trying to protect had been the instrument of his destruction. The investigation he'd believed was about justice had been manipulated from the beginning. Everything he'd sacrificed had been built on lies. Colt, Sadie said softly, recognizing the signs of a man's faith crumbling. Whatever he's telling you, it doesn't change what you did here today. It doesn't change the lives you've saved or the family you've built. But Morrison wasn't done destroying his old friend's illusions. Oh, it gets better, he wheezed. Want to know the real reason you survived that mine collapse? Want to know why they left you alive when they could have finished the job? Stop, Dr. Hollis commanded, but Morrison's voice rose above the physician's protests. Because a crippled, broken-down marshal was more useful to them than a dead one. As long as you were alive but neutralized, the federal government wouldn't send another investigator. They could point to you and say the territory was being properly supervised. You weren't a survivor. Ramsey, you were a scarecrow. The words hung in the air like poison, and Colt felt something fundamental shatter. Inside his chest. Not his spine this time, but something deeper, the bedrock certainty that his life had meaning, that his struggles had purpose. Emma chose that moment to let out a small cry, the sound of a baby who sensed the emotional turmoil around her, even if she couldn't understand its source. The pure, innocent sound cut through Morrison's venomous revelations like sunlight through storm clouds. Sadie immediately began soothing their daughter, her gentle voice a counterpoint to the hatred that had filled the air moments before. Little one, you're safe. Your papa's here, and he's going to keep us all safe. Your papa. The words struck Colt with unexpected force, reminding him of truths that transcended Morrison's attempts to poison the past. Yes, he'd been deceived and manipulated. Yes, his investigation had been compromised from the beginning. but the man who'd helped deliver Emma during a blizzard, who'd taught Sadie to defend herself, who'd organized an entire community to stand against evil, that man was real. That work mattered. Morrison seemed to realize he was losing his psychological advantage. It's all meaningless, you know. Even if you expose the corruption, even if you bring down every official in the territory, there will always be others. There will always be people willing to hurt the innocent for profit. You're probably right, Colt said quietly, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. There probably will always be evil in the world. But that doesn't mean we stop fighting. He gestured toward the townspeople of Widow's Ridge, who were moving through their battle-scarred community with purpose and determination. Look around you, Jake. See what people can accomplish when they decide to stand together against men like you. You may have manipulated my investigation, but you couldn't manipulate their courage. Morrison's eyes were growing glazed with pain. And medication Dr. Hollis had administered, but he managed one final strike. And when the next group of raiders comes? When word spreads that Widow's Ridge has money and weapons worth taking? How long do you think your little community will last? As long as it needs to, Sadie answered before Colt could respond. Because we're not just a community anymore, we're a family. And families protect each other. As if to emphasize her point, Martha Kellerman appeared at Colt's shoulder, her face streaked with powder burns, but her eyes bright with fierce satisfaction. Marshal, the prisoners are secured and the wounded are stable. Sheriff Brennan wants to know if you're ready to start processing the evidence. Behind her came a steady stream of townspeople, men and women who'd fought alongside them, who'd risked everything to defend their home. They gathered around Colt, not as subjects approaching authority, but as equals who'd proven themselves in battle. We did it, said Tommy Morrison, his arm in a sling, but his smile undimmed. We actually did it. You did it, corrected Widow Henley, surprising everyone by grasping Colt's hand with her weathered fingers. You showed us what we were capable of. Dr. Hollis looked up from his patient, his expression troubled but determined. Morrison's losing consciousness. Whatever else you need from him, it had better wait until tomorrow. Colt nodded, but his attention was no longer focused on the wounded raider. Around him, the people of Widow's Ridge were beginning the process of rebuilding, of moving forward from this night that had changed everything. Children who'd been hidden during the battle were emerging to find their parents. Women were organizing food for the defenders. Men were already discussing improvements to their defensive positions. Morrison had been right about one thing. There would always be evil in the world, always be people willing to hurt others for profit or pleasure. But he'd been wrong about what that meant. The existence of evil didn't make the fight against it meaningless. It made that fight essential. Colt looked down at Emma, sleeping peacefully in Sadie's arms, despite the chaos around her. This little girl would grow up in a world where her father had stood up to criminals and corruption, where her community had proven that ordinary people could accomplish extraordinary things when they worked together. That wasn't meaningless. That was everything. Marshal? Sheriff Brennan approached with a leather satchel that contained Morrison's evidence. What do you want to do with all this? Colt accepted the satchel, feeling its weight not just in pounds but in the lives. It represented the families who'd been victimized, the officials who'd been corrupted, the territory that deserved better than rule by fear and greed. We're going to finish what we started, he said firmly. We're going to expose every name in those documents, prosecute every official who betrayed their oath, and make sure something like this never happens again. And if it does happen again? Asked Martha. Colt smiled, the expression transforming his battle-worn face. Then we'll be ready for it, all of us. As the moon rose over Widow's Ridge, casting silver light on a community that had proven itself capable of remarkable courage, Colt reflected on Morrison's revelations. Yes, his original investigation had been compromised. Yes, he'd been deceived and manipulated. But those failures had led him to something more valuable than any case he'd ever solved. A family, a community, and the unshakable knowledge that some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the odds. The battle was over, but the war for justice was just beginning. And this time, Marshal Colt Ramsey wouldn't be fighting alone. Dawn broke over Widow's Ridge like a benediction, painting the battlefield in shades of gold and promise. The town that had faced annihilation 12 hours earlier was awakening. To a new reality, they had not merely survived, they had triumphed. But with victory came the sobering realization that their greatest challenge still lay ahead. Colt sat in his wheelchair on the porch of the cabin that had become home. Emma cradled in his arms while Sadie prepared breakfast inside. The baby was fascinated by the morning light, her tiny hands reaching toward the sun as if she could capture its warmth. It was a peaceful moment that belied the magnitude of the decisions that needed to be made. Dr. Hollis approached from the direction of his office, where he'd spent the night tending to the wounded from both sides of the battle. His face showed the exhaustion of a man who'd worked through the darkest hours, but his step carried the satisfaction of lives saved. "How are our patients?" Colt asked as the doctor climbed the porch steps. "Morrison will live, though he'll never have full use of that arm again. The other prisoners are stable. As for our own people..." Dr. Hollis settled into the chair Sadie had brought out for him. "Tommy's shoulder will heal clean, and the others took mostly minor wounds. We were remarkably fortunate." "Not fortunate," Colt corrected. "Prepared. The difference saved lives." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Two men who'd seen too much violence but understood its necessity when evil left no other choice. Emma gurgled contentedly, apparently unaware that she was being held by a man who'd become a legend overnight. "Colt," Dr. Hollis said eventually, "there's something we need to discuss. About your condition. About what happened yesterday when you stood up. I know what you're going to say, that I risked permanent damage, that I should never have attempted. Something so strenuous. Actually," the doctor interrupted, "I was going to say that what you did should have been medically impossible. The stress on your healing spine, the complex muscle coordination required by all rights. You should have collapsed immediately." Colt looked down at Emma, who was staring up at him with the absolute trust that only babies possessed. "Maybe I had the right motivation. Maybe you had more healing than either of us realized. I want to run some tests, examine the extent of your recovery. It's possible that the electrical therapy combined with your determination has accomplished something truly remarkable." Before Colt could respond, the sound of approaching horses interrupted their conversation. But these weren't the ominous hoofbeats of raiders. This was the organized cadence of official business. Sheriff Brennan appeared around the corner of the cabin, leading a group of men in federal uniforms. "Marshal Ramsey," Brennan called, "you have visitors. Official ones." The lead rider dismounted and approached the porch with the bearing of a career law enforcement officer. He was perhaps 50 years old, with gray hair and a kind of weathered face that spoke of long years in the saddle. The badge on his chest identified him as a U.S. Marshal, and the deference shown by his companions suggested significant rank. "Marshal Ramsey," he said formally. "I'm Deputy Chief Marshal William Harrison, Territorial Division. I'm here in response to the telegraph Sheriff Brennan sent last night regarding the capture of Jake Morrison and his associates." Colt shifted Emma to one arm and extended his free hand. "Marshal Harrison, I'm surprised Washington responded so quickly. We've been tracking Morrison's gang for months. When we learned they'd finally been stopped, and by a marshal we'd given up for dead." Harrison's expression softened slightly. "Well, let's just say certain people in high places are very interested in hearing your story." Over the next hour, as Sadie served coffee and the morning sun climbed higher, Colt provided a detailed account of the events that had led to the previous night's battle. Harrison listened with the attention of a professional, occasionally asking pointed questions that revealed his own extensive knowledge of the corruption case. "The documents Morrison carried," Harrison said eventually, "they're exactly what we need to clean house across the entire territorial administration. Names, dates, financial records, enough evidence to prosecute dozens of officials and permanently dismantle the network that's been terrorizing honest settlers." "What happens now?" Sadie asked, settling beside Colt with her own cup of coffee. "Now we begin the largest corruption investigation in territorial history," Harrison replied, "and Marshal Ramsey leads it." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Colt understood what was being offered: reinstatement to active duty, a chance to complete the work he'd started, the opportunity to bring real justice to a territory that had suffered too long under corrupt leadership. "I'm honored by the confidence," Colt said carefully, "but I think you may be overestimating my current capabilities." Harrison smiled. "I saw you stand up yesterday, Marshal. Sheriff Brennan's telegram was quite detailed about your actions during the battle. A man who can organize an entire community's defense and personally arrest the territory's most wanted criminal doesn't sound limited to me. There are other considerations." Colt looked at Sadie, at Emma sleeping peacefully in his arms, at the cabin that had become their sanctuary. "I have a family now. Responsibilities that go beyond law enforcement." "Which is exactly why you're the right man for this job," Harrison said firmly. "The corruption investigation will be based here, in Widow's Ridge. You'll have a permanent appointment as territorial marshal, with a staff of federal agents and the authority to pursue criminals wherever the evidence leads." Sadie leaned forward, her eyes bright with possibility. "You're offering to make this our permanent home?" "I'm offering to make it the headquarters for territorial law enforcement. Marshal Ramsey would oversee all federal operations in the region, with the full backing of Washington. The community that proved itself capable of stopping Morrison's gang would become the symbol of law and order in the Dakota Territory." The implications were staggering. Instead of being forced to choose between duty and family, Colt was being offered a position that would allow him to pursue both. Widow's Ridge would become not just their home, but a beacon of justice in a region that had known too much lawlessness. "There would be significant changes," Harrison continued. "We'd need to build proper facilities, a federal courthouse, a jail capable of holding dangerous prisoners, quarters for visiting officials. The town would grow, probably double in size within 5 years. And the people who live here now?" Colt asked. "The families who fought alongside us last night would become the foundation of something unprecedented, a frontier community built around the principle that law and order can coexist with individual freedom. They'd be the first citizens of what could become the most successful settlement in the territory." Dr. Hollis, who'd been listening quietly, finally spoke up. "It's a remarkable opportunity, Colt, but it's also a tremendous responsibility. Are you certain you're ready to take on something this significant?" Colt looked around at the faces surrounding him, friends who'd become family, officials who'd traveled hundreds of miles to offer him a chance at redemption, a baby who represented all the reasons why the fight for justice mattered. Then he looked at Sadie, whose expression told him that whatever he decided, she would support completely. "I have one condition," he said finally. "Name it," Harrison replied. "Sheriff Brennan becomes my chief deputy. Martha Kellerman gets the contract to supply federal facilities. Dr. Hollis becomes the territorial medical examiner. And every person who fought in that battle last night gets preferential consideration for any federal employment that becomes available." Harrison smiled. "Marshal Ramsey, those aren't conditions. They're exactly the kind of appointments I was hoping you'd recommend. The people who prove themselves capable of stopping Morrison's gang are exactly the kind of people we need in territorial law enforcement." As the morning progressed and the details of the new arrangement were discussed, Colt felt something he hadn't experienced in years, a sense of complete alignment between duty and desire, between what he wanted to do and what he needed to do. The man who'd believed his usefulness was over had been offered the chance to build something lasting, something that would protect not just his own family, but countless others. Emma woke from her nap as the official discussions were concluding, and her bright cry brought smiles to the faces of hardened federal marshals. As Sadie took their daughter to feed her, Harrison made his final point. "Marshal Ramsey, what you accomplished here goes beyond law enforcement. You prove that ordinary people can stand against extraordinary evil when they have the right leadership. That's exactly the kind of thinking we need to transform this territory. When would you need an answer?" Colt asked. "I already have one," Harrison replied, gesturing toward the town where people were moving with renewed purpose, their faces bright with the confidence of victory. "Any man who could inspire this kind of community response has already proven he's ready for whatever challenges come next." As the federal officials prepared to depart, carrying with them Morrison's evidence and the prisoners who would stand trial for their crimes, Colt reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. 2 years ago, he'd been a broken man convinced that his life's work was over. Now he was being offered the chance to lead the largest law enforcement operation in territorial history. But more than that, he was being offered the chance to build something permanent, a community where justice and family could flourish together, where broken things could be made whole, and where love could triumph over the darkest forces the world had to offer. Are you ready for this? Sadie asked softly, returning with Emma as the dust from the departing official settled. I'm ready for anything, Colt replied, as long as I'm facing it with you. As the sun reached its zenith over Widow's Ridge, Marshal Colt Ramsey began planning for a future that would exceed his wildest dreams, not just personal redemption, but the transformation of an entire territory through the simple but revolutionary idea that good people, working together, could build something better than anything they'd inherited. 5 years later, the settlement that had once been called Widow's Ridge bore little resemblance to the struggling frontier town where a pregnant widow and a paralyzed cowboy had first found each other. The wooden sign at the town's entrance now read Ramsey's Ridge, and beneath it, in smaller letters, Territorial Capital, population 847. The transformation had been remarkable by any measure. Where once stood a collection of ramshackle buildings around a dusty main street, there now rose a proper town with brick courthouse, a modern jail, a schoolhouse that served children from across the territory, and a telegraph office that kept the community connected to the rapidly expanding nation beyond the frontier. But perhaps the most remarkable change was visible in the man who sat on the porch of the house that had grown around the original cabin, watching his daughter chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. Marshal Colt Ramsey no longer needed his wheelchair except for the longest days, though he kept it nearby as a reminder of the journey that had brought him to this place of contentment. Emma, now 5 years old and blessed with her mother's determination and her father's tactical mind, had appointed herself the town's unofficial welcoming committee. Any stranger who rode into Ramsey's Ridge could expect to be greeted by a small girl with bright eyes, who would solemnly inform them that her papa was the marshal and her mama made the best biscuits in the territory. She's going to be trouble when she gets older, Sadie observed, settling beside Colt with the easy grace of a woman who'd found her place in the world. At 32, she bore the confidence of someone who'd faced the worst life could offer and emerged victorious. She already is trouble, Colt replied with obvious affection. Yesterday, she convinced 3 federal agents to help her build a fort. In the backyard, they've been calling her Deputy Emma all week. They sat in comfortable silence, watching their daughter's joyful pursuit of the dancing lights. Around them, the sounds of a thriving community provided a gentle backdrop, children playing, adults calling goodnight to neighbors, the distant sound of music from the hotel or traveling merchants and federal officials lodged during their business in the territorial capital. The success of Ramsey's Ridge had exceeded even Marshal Harrison's optimistic projections. The corruption investigation that had begun with Morrison's capture had eventually implicated over 60 territorial officials, leading to the largest governmental reorganization in Western history. More importantly, it had established a precedent for community-based law enforcement that was being studied and replicated across the frontier. Any word from Dr. Hollis? Sadie asked, referring to their old friend who is currently in Washington, testifying before a congressional committee on territorial medicine. Telegraph this morning. The committee was impressed with his rural healthcare innovations. They're considering making his model standard for all frontier territories. It was a fitting recognition for the man who'd not only saved Colt's mobility, but had pioneered medical techniques that were now improving lives across the West. His clinic in Ramsey's Ridge had become a teaching hospital where young doctors learned to provide quality care under primitive conditions. Martha Kellerman approached from the direction of the hotel she now managed, her success as a federal contractor having transformed her from saloon keeper to one of the territory's most influential businesswomen. Behind her walked Sheriff Brennan, or rather, Chief Deputy Brennan, whose law enforcement innovations had earned him recognition from Washington to California. Evening, Marshal, Martha said with the familiarity of old friendship. Sadie, house. Our little deputy this evening? Terrorizing the fireflies, Sadie replied. and probably planning tomorrow's adventures. Speaking of adventures, Renan said, settling into one of the chairs that had been arranged for evening conversations, we received an interesting proposal today. The governor of Montana Territory wants to know if we'd be willing to send a team to help organize their law enforcement structure. Colt raised an eyebrow. Following our model? More than that. They want you specifically to oversee the transition. 6 months in Helena, full authority to reorganize their territorial marshals. Service. It was the kind of opportunity that would have thrilled the man Colt had been before his injury. A chance to expand his influence, to tackle new challenges, to build something significant on a larger scale. But the man he'd become measured opportunities. Differently. Emma starts school this fall, he said simply. And Sadie's expecting again. The last statement brought smiles from Martha and Brennan, though Sadie blushed slightly at having their news announced so casually. Congratulations, Martha said warmly. When's the baby due? Early spring, Sadie replied. Dr. Hollis says everything. Looks perfect. Another future deputy, Brennan observed with amusement. At this rate, you'll have your own law enforcement dynasty. Emma chose that moment to abandon her firefly pursuit and race toward the porch, her small face glowing with excitement. Papa, I caught one. Look, she opened her cupped hands to reveal a firefly that immediately took advantage of its freedom to escape into the darkening sky. Far from being disappointed, Emma clapped her hands in delight. He was beautiful. Did you see how bright he was? I did indeed, Colt said, lifting his daughter onto his lap. Almost as bright as you are. Emma giggled at the compliment, then turned serious with the sudden mood changes that characterized childhood. Papa, Mrs. Henderson says her husband wants to move away because he thinks the town's getting too big. Will everyone move away when it gets bigger? It was a more profound question than Emma realized, touching on concerns that had been discussed in town meetings and federal planning sessions. Growth brought opportunities, but it also brought changes that not everyone welcomed. Some people might move on, Colt said carefully. But the people who really belong here, who helped build what we have, they'll stay, because this is home. Like us. Like us. Martha and Brennan exchanged glances, recognizing the deeper meaning in the conversation. The success of Ramsey's Ridge had attracted attention from politicians and businessmen who saw opportunities for exploitation rather than community building. Maintaining the town's character while accommodating growth was an ongoing challenge. Actually, Martha said, that brings up something we've been meaning to discuss. The territorial legislature is considering a proposal to incorporate Ramsey's Ridge as an official city with expanded powers of self-governance. What would that mean in practice? Sadie asked. Local control over development, the right to refuse federal projects that don't serve community interests, and most importantly, the authority to preserve what we've built here, Brennan explained, nodded. Was an appealing prospect, a chance to ensure that Ramsey's Ridge would continue to embody the principles of justice and community that had guided its transformation. But Colt had learned to be cautious about opportunities that seemed too good to be true. What's the catch? No catch, Martha replied. Just responsibility. We'd be committing to serve as a model for other frontier communities. Success would mean more attention, more federal oversight, more pressure to replicate our achievements elsewhere. And failure would set back community-based law enforcement by decades, Brennan said soberly, as they discussed the implications. Of incorporation, Emma fell asleep in Colt's arms, her small body relaxed with the complete trust that came from growing up in a world where she was absolutely safe and completely loved. Looking down at his daughter, Colt reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment of decision. The broken man who'd once believed his usefulness was over had been offered the chance to shape the future of an entire territory. The pregnant widow who'd arrived with nothing but determination had become the foundation of a community that was changing how people thought about frontier life. The baby born in a blizzard was growing up in a world where justice and compassion were more than ideals, they were daily realities. I think, Colt said finally, that we've spent enough time building something worth preserving. The question is whether we're ready to commit to protecting it for the next generation. He looked around at the faces of his friends, his family, his community. Martha, who'd transformed herself from saloon keeper to business leader. Brennan, who'd evolved from small-town sheriff to territorial law enforcement innovator. Sadie, who'd grown from frightened refugee to the heart of a thriving community. What do you think? He asked them. I think, Sadie said, taking his free hand in hers, that we've already proven what's possible when people decide to build something better than what they inherited. If we can help other communities do the same thing, isn't that worth the risk? Emma stirred in his arms, making the small sounds of a child dreaming peaceful dreams. In a few months, she would have a brother or sister to protect and guide. In a few years, she would inherit the community they were building, along with the responsibility to preserve and improve it. All right, Colt said, his decision made with the certainty that came from absolute conviction. Let's make history. As the stars emerged over Ramsey's Ridge, casting silver light on a community that had become a symbol of hope across the frontier, Marshal Colton Ramsey reflected on the words that had been carved into the stone foundation of the new courthouse: justice, community, family, the foundation of civilization. They were simple words, but they represented a truth that had been proven through struggle and sacrifice, that broken things could be made whole, that love could triumph over the darkest forces, and that ordinary people working together could build something extraordinary. Got the pregnant widow, who'd been given a paralyzed cowboy as a cruel joke, had indeed made him the hero of the frontier. But more than that, she'd helped him become something he'd never thought possible, a man whose greatest victories were measured not in criminals captured or cases solved, but in the laughter of children playing safely in the streets, in the confidence of neighbors who trusted each other, and in the quiet satisfaction of a community that had chosen hope over fear. As Emma slept peacefully in his arms, and Sadie's hand rested gently on the life growing within her, Colt understood that this was what victory looked like, not the dramatic triumph of good over evil, but the steady, patient work of building something worth defending, one day at a time, one act of love at a time, one choice to stand together rather than fall apart. The future stretched before them like an open prairie, full of challenges and opportunities they couldn't yet imagine. But whatever came next, they would face it together, as a family, as a community, as people who had learned that the most important battles weren't fought with guns and badges, but with courage and compassion, and the unshakable conviction that everyone deserved a chance to build something better. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the plains, carrying the promise of new arrivals, new challenges, new opportunities to prove that the principles they'd established in Ramsey's Ridge could transform not just one community, but an entire nation. Marshal Colton Ramsey smiled as he carried his sleeping daughter inside, followed by the woman who'd taught him that love was the strongest foundation for any life worth living. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight they were home.